So this lecture will introduce archives and oral history. Archives are very important for the historian. Archives are institutions, typically one building, or they could consist of multiple buildings, or sometimes they're a floor or a room in some other building. But their main task is to preserve documents of importance and to make those documents available to people who would like to do research. And sometimes these are private and they're very difficult to get access to, but a lot of them are actually public and are run by governments. So for example, what you see in this image is a picture of the South Carolina archives in Columbia. And if you wanted to, you could very easily go and have a look at these, the archives there. And frequently the South Carolina Historical Association actually meets at that archives. Archives can also be on a national level. For example, this is one of the buildings that represents the National Archives. The National Archives actually has institutions all over the United States, but they also have kind of their main headquarters in Washington, D.C., and you can see the beautiful architecture there. I mean, you go in there and you definitely are going to feel like a historian, and we will actually have several videos in this week that will examine those national archives. Now, what's curious is that the archives themselves have a kind of history. There's something in their modern form that actually developed in Europe, right? So they have a strong connection to the West. In another lecture in this series for this week, I will talk about the pre-modern Korean Catholic archives, and that came out of a workshop on the pre-modern Korean archives. One thing we talked about was that in the Korea lacked archives in the traditional sense. They did save some important documents, but these usually weren't kind of raw documents. These were documents that had been edited and collected. So for example, in Korea, there were historians who wrote down what happened at the royal court each day, and after the king died, the notes of the historians were used to write an official history of the king. However, after they wrote the official history, they destroyed the notes, right? So they didn't actually keep, in a sense, the primary documents, or they kept the primary documents that were quoted in the main history, but they got rid of everything else. For whatever reasons, and we're not going to go into that here in this lecture, in Western Europe, the archives were developed and the documents were maintained, right? They kept the documents. And one thing that we have to understand, what's kind of curious about the archives, is that documents were often created for practical reasons that had nothing to do with history. They often consisted of documents that were not written down because people thought, hey, I wonder what, maybe in 100 years historians will want to write about this. They were just records that people needed to have maybe refer to or to have access to. So for example, records of baptisms and marriages. And those are important in part because, of course, they show who's married to who and who has been baptized and who hasn't. But those might also take part in legal proceedings, right? When someone dies and they say, hey, I have a claim, I'm related to this person, they could use documents like that to prove it. Similarly, there were also often contracts that were kept. So people, and sometimes these contracts could go on for long periods of time, and if there was a dispute or a discussion about what each party owed the other, they could refer to the government record of that contract, right? So that way, so these records, you can see, were kept for very practical reasons, just to keep track, like I said, of various demographic information and for legal reasons. What's interesting, though, of course, is that historians could use those sources to figure out things about the past, right? If we can study marriage patterns. We can say, hey, you know what? It seems like for some reason the age of people getting married went up in this time period, or it went down in this time period, or hey, you know what? It looks like a lot of people are not being baptized in this time period. What does that mean? Right? And of course, if we look at contracts, we can look and say, hey, you know what? It looks like this contract between a farmer and a landlord, it seems like the farmer's getting a better deal over time, right? If we compare contracts from the 1600s and contracts from the 1700s, what's going on there, right? So you had these documents that were created for practical reasons, and then historians could refer back to these documents, right, to figure out something that maybe the people making the document did not intend, right, or had not did not have in mind, right? When they recorded baptisms, they were just thinking about the kid, right? Or the contract, they were just thinking about money and what was fair. They weren't thinking about the future. And a person who's going to, it's interesting because, of course, these archives existed for hundreds of years in the West. However, it was a man named Leopold von Ranke who's considered kind of the pioneer of modern history, right? There, when you take History 399, or if you haven't taken it yet, it looks at the kind of history of history, and it looks at all these different historians, and we've had historians since ancient times. But he, in a sense, is one of the most, is considered kind of the pioneer of modern history because he really emphasizes using archival documents to write history, right? So he's going to actually, instead of just looking at like what someone said about a pope, he's going to actually find the letters that a pope wrote or something like that to analyze, what that person was thinking, right? So he's going to be the person who's going to really pioneer this idea of using primary sources that have not been already compiled into history books or something like that, unedited in a sense, to write history. And that becomes kind of the gold standard for history, right? You focus on primary sources written during the time period to do history. Now, one thing, though, you'll notice about him is that he focused, if you look at what he was writing about, he often focused on the 16th and the 17th century. And this is because the archives were often people did not want to open more recent archives, right? It's interesting that people understood that knowledge was power. And so they were not interested in making those documents available to historians, right? So he was actually forced to write about things that happened 100 or 200 years beforehand, right? So sometimes for example, if I recall correctly, the Holy Roman Empire, when it opened up its documents, and I'm referring to the kind of the people who followed after the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when they opened up the documents on the Holy Roman Empire in the 19th century, they only opened them up to the 16th century, right? So there were 300 years of documents they didn't want anyone looking at, right? So knowledge often equals power, right? And that's why Ranke had to look at this kind of earlier history. However, the rise of democracy and ideas of liberty in Europe and later the United States, and the idea of professional historians who need access to these documents so that we can write histories that are objective and fair, so people can actually learn from history by learning, what actually happened, that's going to lead to archives becoming increasingly open, right? So now it's common in Europe and the United States to be able to access archives freely, especially if you're a historian, and particularly public archives. Private archives, they can kind of do what they want, but public archives have to be open. In contrast, in places like Russia and China, it's much harder to get access to the archives, right? So democracy, its rise in profession, and the professionalization of the role of the historian as someone who learns what actually happened in history so we can learn lessons for today from it, leads to the opening of the archives. Now, again, typically, and I've got a video that's going to talk about this, how archives work. A lot of times you go to the archive, and it's kind of cool because you'll put in a request for a particular document. The archivist will go and get that document, and then you can look at it, and you can take notes. You may even be allowed to take pictures, but it's the only copy of that document, so they want you to be really careful. And then after a while, when you're done, they'll come and take the document and put it away. And I remember, as a high school student, when I was a Civil War reenactor, I reenacted a particular person, a man named Henry Marsh. And some of his letters were actually at the state library, so it was really cool. So I went to go to the state library and actually read his actual letters that he wrote. And it was really cool, but, I had to be very careful with them. And I had to, I put in a request, they got the letters, and then they put them in there and they took them out. And that's kind of what doing archival research is like. It's really awesome. It's really cool. To actually touch the physical letters and be right there. But there's a couple problems, right? First of all, what happens if you live far away from the documents you want to look at? And let's say that you're in South Carolina and you want to do research on something in Indiana, like what I did, State Library. Well, you'd have to travel to Indiana, get a hotel room, and then stay there for however long it takes to do the research. And what's a problem is sometimes archives are not completely cataloged, and so you won't know if you think, okay, maybe they'll have something interesting here, but you won't know until you get there. So you may invest a large amount of money, and then it's a bust. So one thing that archives, especially government archives, have done, both to protect precious documents. So, it's bad for a document to continuously be looked at by people, but also to make them more freely available is to put together document collections. So, for example, one document collection I actually use somewhat, and Dr. Ryan Floyd uses a lot, is the Foreign Relations of the United States. And these are a collection of different documents related to our diplomatic relations, right? You can see there East Asia and the Pacific. That's what those particular ones focus on. And those are ones I use. And so so what they did is, maybe I can't afford to go to Washington, D.C., or it would take a long time. Well, that's okay. I could have our library purchase, the Foreign Relations of the United States, or a nearby library might purchase them, and I can go to that library that's closer and I can look at the documents that way. So a lot of times archives do their best to make documents available on to a wider group of people, and that's hard sometimes for private documents or private archives because they don't have much money. But the United States can do that, right? In this case, with the FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States. In addition, there is something called what we can call the digital archives. So in the in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was enough just to make the books, and that was very convenient to have them out there. But now that we have high-speed internet, why not just put those documents online? So FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States, is also available online, right? So you can do, in a sense, archival research that you wouldn't have been able to do in the past from the comfort of your room, right? As long as you can do a search for it. And what's cool is you can actually download the documents as PDFs. And I'm actually have undertaken some research using those documents, and it's really neat. So, it's getting easier and easier to do archival research. In a sense, you don't need to actually go to a physical archives to do archival primary source research. And what's neat is, these documents themselves are searchable. In the past, I'd have to read through very carefully each page to look for a particular person. So, for example, I was doing research on a man named Jenkins. Now I can just do a search for Jenkins, right? So it's very easy, very convenient to use. So now I need to explain to you a little bit about the videos that I'm assigning for this section. This first group of videos, none of them are over 12 minutes long. Most of them are under 5 minutes long, so it looks like a lot, but it's actually not so bad. And these are meant to help familiar you with what goes on at archives and the different kinds of how people use archives, how documents are preserved, what sort of documents are available, and some of the issues that the archivists have to deal with. And I think this gives kind of a good introduction, gives you kind of a hand-on approach. And you may say after watching these, say, wow, I think being an archivist would be really cool. And then that would be, something you could pursue. The next group of videos is a little more complex. The first two, it says the Archives, the Washington Parade, and Democracy Starts Here, What's in the National Archives. Those are kind of interesting because they're documentaries made about the archives in different time periods. And there's a response paper question about that, asking you to compare those two videos. So as you watch that, just kind of keep that in mind. I wanted us to see a little bit about South Carolina too. Those are all the national archives, but there's a nice video about the South Carolina's archives. And I mean, if you're going to do some archival research, that's a great place to go, is to do local or state history. The next video clip is called, or the Struggle for the Files is not actually a video clip. It is a podcast. It's another one of those New Books Network interviews, and it's talking about the fate of the Nazi archives. So I think it's pretty cool, and they talk about some of the different things people did trying to maintain and how those archives and how the Germans tried to get them back. And the last one is a lecture by me about the Korean Catholic archives. Those are the archives I deal the most with, and so I thought I would talk a little bit about how those work. Now, here's the thing though. What happens when a document is missing, right? Sometimes students will come to me and will say, you know what, Dr. Rausch, I would like to do a research project on this. And I have this question. And I'll say, that's a great question. That's a great project. However, there's no documents that help you with that, right? You've come up with a really good idea. You've come up with a really good historical question, but there's just nothing you can do with it because there's no sources. So this is the problem with archives in a sense. And I should say it's not the fault of any archivist, but sometimes people don't write down things. And one of my big points in my lecture about the Korean archives is that there's lots of things we'd like to know about 19th century Korea through the Catholic archives, but because those documents focus on martyrdom, we can learn a lot about martyrdom, but we can't learn about other things because people didn't think they were important, didn't write them down. So this is a problem, right? A lot of history is simply lost because people at the time didn't think it was important to talk about, in part because they thought it was so commonplace. Why would you bother talking about it? And remember, one of the big points of public history, it's not just making it available to the public, it's telling the public about people like them, right? We're not just going to talk about presidents or politicians or business leaders. We need to talk about average everyday people, some of whom maybe didn't write much or who didn't write at all. And that's a problem. How do you then, these people did not leave documents preserved in archives, so we'd like to know about them. Well, what can we do? And what people do was oral history. Right? Oral history involves going around and doing interviews with people, talking to them about their lives. So in this way, you can capture that history. Now, the people have to still be alive, right? I mean, you can't do, if the people have all passed away, you can't really ask them any questions. However, part of oral history isn't just asking people questions and then just hearing their answers, but recording and even transcribing those interviews so that other people can use them. And so, for example, and the Jackson Library at Lander has these after, one issue of writing, the one problem with writing the history of slavery is slaves tended to be illiterate, right? The vast majority of slaves could not read or write. So how do you find out what history was like from their perspective, right? And you think about this, right? The slave owners wanted to try and make slavery look as good as possible, and they were the ones that typically would write about slavery and say how great it was, right? And how they were good masters and so forth. And so how do we see the slave's perspective? Well, one thing that people did was, with the development of oral history, they went and asked former slaves what it had been like. Now, a lot of times these were men and women who were in their 70s or 80s by the time people asked them, but at least they were able to remember something of what it was like to be a slave. And those oral histories have been written down and transcribed, and there's some in the Jackson Library, in fact, here at Lander. So this is how we can deal with this fact that sometimes there's things that aren't in the archives that we wish were in the archives, right? And if you're dealing with history where people, if you want to know something about the 1950s, find people who lived in the 1950s and ask them what about it, right? So oral history allows us to talk to people, to get information from average everyday people, including people who maybe could not read and write. So it's a very important part of public history. Now, I have some experience in an attempt to do oral history. I was asked to be a part of an oral history project, and the project failed. And sometimes that happens with history. I conducted a few interviews, but it became very quickly obvious that people did not want to be interviewed for the project, and there wasn't going to be any support for making transcriptions or whatever, or making these available to other people. So I just kind of stopped, right? If people don't want to be interviewed, if people don't want the interviews to be recorded and made available, it doesn't make sense to continue to do those interviews. And this had to do with Korean history. I'm not sure why people didn't want to be interviewed. I guess it was too recent. But in any case, I was part of a failed oral history project, and I did conduct some interviews, and also I did interviews for the New Books Network. And oral history is really cool, but it's also really, really difficult because you're dealing, of course, with living people, with people who have their own agendas, who may argue with you, and it can be quite complex. So there on the right, you can see an image. That's my PhD advisor in the book we wrote together. He did most of the work, I should say, and I interviewed him for this New Books Network. And he was a great person to interview. The interview went really, really well. But some people that I interviewed, it was very tricky. It was very difficult. People would be late to interviews. People would forget that I was supposed to interview them. People would not follow the technology they were supposed to use. Like I did the interviews, it was supposed to be by Skype, and sometimes the people would not want to use Skype, but would wait till the last second to tell me, and then would want to conduct the interview using a smartphone on speakerphone, and in those cases the interviews sound terrible. So one thing I just want to point out, oral history has a lot of great opportunities. It also has some serious challenges, right? It's really cool. but it also has some problems associated with, and you need to be aware of them if you're going. And you can still do good oral history. You just have to be aware of them and kind of be trained. So there are several videos I want you to watch about oral history. The first is how to do oral history. It's this really good podcast series. It's 5 videos. Each are only about 5 or 6 minutes, so it won't actually take you long to read it or to listen to it. It's really cool. I think they do a fantastic job. And the other 4 videos are examples of oral histories. The first one's about 20 minutes long. It's about the Monaghan Cotton Mills in Greenville, South Carolina. And it's an example of what an oral history might look like. And this is one where they had a good amount of money because they had a camera and they videotaped it. What I did, usually we just did a sound recording. The next 3 videos are all from StoryCorps. The first 2, Germans in the Woods and First Squad, 3rd Platoon, are both just the transcript, and they made like a little cartoon to go with them. And I have a question about that on the response paper to watch those. And those are interesting. They both are connected to the military. The other it says J.T. Johnson and Al Lingo. That's about this attempt to challenge a segregated swimming pool. And that one's a little bit different because if you click on that, it's going to take you to a website and you can listen to the interview. But you also want to look at the transcript as well, and that will help you to kind of understand what's going on. And also one of the other challenges with oral histories is that you don't just do the interviews. A lot of times for a good oral history project, you need to transcribe all or some of the person, what they actually said, and that takes a while. But so those are kind of those videos, and that's what I want you to kind of think about as you watch them. And especially those last 4 tell us kind of the power of public history and how, despite the difficulties and the expense and the time it can take, it really is worth doing. So finally, I need to talk a little bit about the assignments that are due in week 4. So in addition to your usual quizzes and response paper, there are 3 written assignments. The first is a oral history project proposal, right? And if you look at that assignment, it gives a web page. It gives some advice on how to do that. The videos on how to do a good oral history project will help you with that, as well as the oral history reading from the readings. But that's one assignment that's due. Another assignment is the oral history transcript, right? So you're going to actually have to conduct an oral history interview with someone, and you need to record it, right? It's key that you record it, and then that you transcribe it. You write down word for word what they said, right? You have to record it, you have to transcribe and write down word for word what they said. And then the final assignment that is due is the museum primary source report. So this is where you're going to give me information about a primary source that you're going to utilize as part of your museum exhibit. So that's all for this video and for the assignments. And as always, if you have questions, please email me.